Alaska. Live by myself on the bank of the Anchor River. My cabin in North America's farthest west highway point. Just finished up the week and came home. Going to do some Orthodox reading for us tonight, like I normally do. Feeling a little bit not so great today. Stomach's not so happy. Sinuses aren't so happy. I'm going to do the best I can. Pulling up some reading for us. Just put a bunch of Vicks under my nose. It's kind of my go-to for sinus problems and sinus headache. Usually works pretty good. Bear with me a moment while I pull up the next reading for us. First reading that I'm going to do for us. Reign of the Roman Emperor Michael Stratiochius. Oops. I know. I need a haircut and a trim. I'm saving every penny I can. I'm getting myself out of debt that accumulated over years. I'm trying to keep up in a relationship that wasn't a good relationship. Reign of the Roman Emperor Michael Stratiochius, a history of pre-Christian and Christian Europe, by Archpriest Vladislav Sipin. The fall of the West from the Universal Orthodox Church was followed by dramatic events that took place in the Roman Emperor. The reign of Theodora, the niece of the great ruler and commander Basil the Bulgar Slayer, ended the brilliant era of the Macedonian dynasty, which lasted about 2 centuries. It was replaced by a new dynasty, the Komneni, but its reign was preceded by turmoil that lasted for a quarter of a century. When the throne was seized by pretenders who were unable to keep it for a long time and ceded the throne to new rulers, the background of these dramatic perturbations in the capital was defeats on the borders of the empire on a colossal scale. The loss of territories in the east and west, in Asia, Italy, and even the Balkans. Having ascended the throne in her old age almost under compulsion, completely devoid of lust for power, Theodora, unlike her sister Zoe, turned out to be, as it was known, incapable of independent rule, sanctioning government acts prompted by influential courtiers. When her days were numbered, she obediently fulfilled the recommendation to appoint as co-ruler and therefore successor the aged patrician Michael Stratiochius, who was so called because under the Emperor Constantine Monomachos he held the post of Logotheth to the Stratiote treasury, the head of the army treasury. His other nickname was Old Man, which befitted his venerable age. Although the exact date of his birth is unknown, Patriarch Michael Cerularius anointed him to the throne on August 31st, 1056. Empress Theodora died immediately after the coronation of her co-ruler, 1 hour before the end of the year, and according to the Byzantine calendar, The year began on September 1st. A protege of the metropolitan bureaucracy, Michael VI became an obedient executor to the will of the dignitaries who had enthroned him and elected him because of his decrepitude, so that, as under Theodora, the absolute power of his oligarchy would continue under the cover of the titular monarchy. He generously distributed high ranks and titles to the capital's officials, and according to the sarcastic remark of one of them, Michael Psellos, who, it is true, was also a man of sharp intellect, remarkable erudition, a talented writer who called himself a philosopher, the best of the Byzantine historians of his era. The Tsar raised everyone not to the next level, but through one or even higher. And if someone whispered in the king's ear and asked for a fourth, then he also listened to him favorably. And some other petitioner pulling the Tsar from the other side did not receive a refusal even in the fifth. As a result, Michael's generosity led to a real confusion. Psellos, who can also be called a political scientist, to use modern vocabulary, saw the root cause of the failure of the Basileus, in fact, that, like a number of his predecessors on the throne, and unlike such emperors as Nicephorus Phocas or Basil the Bulgar fighter, he was dismissive of the army, more specifically of its highest commanding staff. Emperors, he writes, having ascended the throne, believe that it is quite sufficient for the consolidation of power if they are proclaimed by the civil class. They live side by side with him and therefore think that his goodwill ensures the inviolability of the throne. That is why, having taken possession of the scepter, kings first of all show themselves to the eyes and the ears of the inhabitants of the city, and if they jump with delight, shout like jesters, and make chatty speeches, they think that they have been vouchsafed God's intercession and no longer need any other power. And although the Tsar's power rests on three pillars, the people, the synclite, and the army, they pay little attention to the latter, but on the other hand, before they have time to take power, they shower favors on the first two. An unfortunate illustration of the rashness of such a policy was the sudden fall of Michael Stratiochius, the military commanders, who were not without zeal watching the rise of the capital's dignitaries and courtiers, paid a visit to the emperor. A witness and chronicler of the events that took place in the palace, who was then next to the king's party, Michael Psellos, told about what happened during this audience. The valiant men, true heroes, went to the king, bowed their heads, pronounced the salutes in turn, and that his order remained standing. Michael should have to address them first with royal and generous speeches, and he had first rudely cursed them altogether, and then brought their leader Isaac Comnenus, presided over them, and then the one following him, it was Sycomunes of the colony, heaped abuse on him because he had almost lost Antioch and not destroyed the army. From such a surprise he froze in place, for he was waiting for favors but received insults. Discouraged by this peculiar reception, the commanders who had at hand armed forces stationed mainly on the Asian side of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara began to consult together about ways to remove the ruler who was losing his mind and replace him with the most popular general in the army, Isaac Comnenus. He decided to lead the conspiracy and urged its participants not to rush, to act deliberately and carefully. The officer corps and the Stratiot warriors sympathized with the plan of their military leaders. The warrior class had previously wanted to take power over the Roman state and serve the warrior Tsar, but the military kept their desires secret and only cherished these dreams in their hearts, for they had no one worthy of the throne in mind. Seeing, however, that Isaac stood at the head of the rebellion, they equipped themselves for war, and casting aside all doubts, came to Comnenus. Putting on purple boots on June 8, 1057, Isaac crossed the Rubicon and marched a rebellious army against the capital of the empire. On the territory taken under control, state taxes were regularly levied for the maintenance of the army on the march. In this campaign, the usurper discovered political tact. He appointed everyone's salary, provided the necessary equipment for the military campaign, and promoted in ranks. The one who was of a higher rank was given a higher rank. The one who was of a lower was given a lesser rank, entrusting the protection of his person to his blood relatives and surrounding himself with its ring. Isaac moved forward without fear, although there were usually many things in the army and warriors are more brave than sensible people. Isaac did not raise a sword against any of them, did not punish a single offender on the spot, but instilled fear with his gaze alone, and his frowning eyebrows were stronger than any blow. Soon the rebel army, having crossed the Bosphorus, approached the walls of Byzantium, Constantinople, which alone remained under the rule of the emperor, who did not have an army capable of resisting the numerous, well-trained and battle-hardened army of Isaac Comnenus. Finding himself in a desperate situation, the king turned to Michael Psellos for advice, whom he had recently removed from him. And he, according to Psellos himself, gave him 3 pieces of advice: to make peace with the patriarch St. Michael Cerularius, whom the emperor had quarreled with shortly before the rebellion, in order to win him over to his side, to send envoys to the usurper's camp for negotiations. In order to persuade him to disband his army, they had to promise him everything that could be given without fear, promise the rest for the future, and at the same time try in some way to influence the rebellious army and disperse its ranks. The third and last piece of advice was to pull the regiments from the west, to gather the remaining forces, to invite allies from neighboring barbarian countries to help, to strengthen the foreign army in our service, to place a valiant commander at its head, to form more detachments, and to defend ourselves from advancing hordes on all sides. The Tsar approved the advice, but followed only the last of them. Having gathered a motley army, Michael VI appointed the eunuch Theodore as commander, whom shortly before the queen of the same name had appointed Brodron, the head of the Synclite or Senate, a high position, but more titular than associated with real power. The Synclites gathered rarely, usually in small numbers. Those were in the capital at the appointed time for the meeting, and the Synclite did not have real power in the routine course of affairs, but it could have influenced the outcome of conflicts in moments of crisis. Later, the queen put Theodore in command of the Eastern army stationed in Asia. Despite the considerable numerical superiority of the imperial army over the usurper's army, the battle between them, which took place near Nicaea, was lost by Theodore, after which he resigned, instead of replenishing the battled army and continuing the war as Psellos suspects, not so much out of fear of a second battle as because he switched sides and secretly conspired with Comnenus. The Tsar had no choice. He pinned his hope for retaining the throne only on the successful outcome of the negotiations with the usurper. So he sent the most inventive and eloquent of the courtiers, Psellos, to his camp. Together with him, Constantine Likud and Leo Olophus went to Isaac. On behalf of the emperor, the envoys promised Isaac the title of Caesar and heir to the throne of the aged emperor in the event of reconciliation. Isaac expressed the king's readiness to accept these conditions, but the danger of coming to real power, and in view of the old age of the Tsar and the imminent ascension to the throne of a commander who enjoyed the solidarity support of the military commanders and the army, alarmed the party of the capital's bureaucrats, whose obedient protege was Tsar Michael, especially since there were many supporters of Isaac Comnenus in the capital itself. At the head of the opposition to the clan of bureaucrats and courtiers was Michael Cerularius. St. Sophia, according to Gregory Ostogorsky, turned into a center of anti-government agitation. As a result, the support of Michael the Old collapsed, defeated by the pressure of the supporters of the ascension of Isaac Comnenus in the capital itself, whose spiritual leader was the ecumenical patriarch Michael VI, who no longer clung to power, retired to Hagia Sophia, and abdicated the throne. The news of Michael's abdication was brought to the usurper's camp by messengers from the capital. Having taken monastic vows, Michael the Old Man died 2 years after his abdication, in the year 1059. So there's a little bit of history this time around of Byzantium. And if I don't know if anyone heard the Pope today, what he was saying, but basically calling everyone that didn't want Islam to take over their country racist. That was the gist of the Pope's speech today. If you go to the Christian Prince channel, he talked about it for quite a bit and played the actual Pope's words so that there was no doubt that that's what he said. And it's really, really unfortunate that the Pope's leading so many people into delusion and trying to destroy so many countries. It was really, really a clueless speech that he gave today. And I hope people listen to it and see the problems with it. There's so much horrible stuff going on, and I wish I could show it to you, because the material that I have, if I showed it to people, there would be no way that they'd allow this to grow in their country, that they'd expel every single drop of it. No women or children should ever have to live under Sharia law. It's pure evil. And if anyone's ever read the Quran, then you have no doubt in your mind that it's not a religion. It's a cult. I guess not really even a cult, but more of a gang. Since Muhammad told the Greek scribe Ptolemy that he didn't think of himself as a prophet or a god, and that all that he said, all his stories were made up and they were fiction. That's also in the historical record kept written down by the Romans. And it has no religious input, either Christian or Muslim, into it. It's just facts that Ptolemy wrote down as a scribe when he was working for the Romans. So let's pull up another article and do some more reading. I like to find some good stuff that helps us. The Hope of the Cross of the poet Ivan Kozlov by Marina Biryukova. One second while this translates. I want to talk about a Russian poet, at least one poem of which is probably known to all readers. Evening bells, how many thoughts he evokes about his young days in his native land, where I loved where my father's house is, and how I bidding farewell to him forever. There I listened to the ringing for the first time. Yes, we're talking about Ivan Ivanovich Kozlov. He was 20 years older than Pushkin and outlived him by 3 years and 1 day. It was to Kozlov that the 26-year-old Pushkin dedicated this poetic message from the Mikhailovskoye. Singer, when the earthly world was hidden before you in the darkness, your genius woke up instantly, looked at all that had passed, and in a chorus of bright ghosts he sang wondrous songs. Oh, dear brother, what sounds and tears of delight I will hear them. It was created a new world for you. You see in it and fly, and live again and embrace the idol of youth shattered by youth. And I, since my one verse gave thee a moment of consolation, I want no other reward, nor without reason did I pass through the desert of the world along the dark path. Oh no, no wonder life and lyre were entrusted to me by fate. In the darkness the world is hidden, earthly torments, and you see and you fly. What is it about? The addressee of Pushkin's message was half paralyzed and completely blind. No, not from birth, the disease as a result of which a prosperous metropolitan official, collegiate advisor, a rank corresponding to the rank of colonel, a happy husband and a father, Ivan Ivanovich Kozlov, lost the ability to walk, began to develop when he was already 37 years old. He began to lose his sight 3 years later. Realizing that he was going blind, Ivan Ivanovich tried to peer into the features of his loved ones to keep them at least in his memory. Look at them, that terrible darkness coming in which you will not see them children's traits. You know the time changes. Over the years it gives a new look. Be afraid this form will change, and their image will not be the one that will be preserved in the heart. And with desperate longing I fixed my dim gaze on them. For a moment I was afraid to leave them. I pressed them to my chest. I forgot to think in grief. I looked at them, but he was already hiding. To me, a sweet sight in some darkness. It disappeared, merged with the darkness, and what is there seemed to me a long gone dream. At the age of 42, Ivan Ivanovich lost his eyesight completely. Like any person overtaken by such misfortune, he had to go through despair. But the Lord comes to the aid of bright, open, believing, and trusting souls. O friend, believe me, the only God, incomprehensible in his destinies, only he, the Almighty, helped me to endure this unbearable blow. Already I was losing heart, already languishing in despair, though he did not dare to murmur, but he was afraid to hope. Already in this wild sorrow, my thoughts were overshadowed. Both life and death and my fate seemed equally terrible. But suddenly, praise be to you, Creator, thou hast not forgotten thy creation. You see the depths of hearts, you hear the secret prayer. Praise you, my fear is gone, like a peaceful, grace-filled angel, like a messenger of heaven's mercy, invisible, secret, but understandable. Something was hovering above me, the soul caught a joyful voice, and faith with a fiery stream, quickened by the heart of the sufferer. Before his misfortune, Kozlov was acquainted with many writers, and let's say was no stranger to the literary environment. But all his works, known and published to this day, date back to the dark time. Yes, it was after losing freedom of movement and becoming blind that he began to write poetry. The first of the famous ones is To Svetlana. It is dedicated to Alexandra Andreevna Voykova Neprostova, Protasova, the sister of the same Masha Protasova, the failed bride and long-term love of Vasily Zhukovsky. Alexandra's name was Svetlana because Vasily Andreevich dedicated the poem Svetlana to her, and Alexandra Andreevna was a great friend of the family of Ivan Kozlov, as was the Zhukovsky in his poem. Ivan Ivanovich calls his friend Svetlana not to feel sorry for him, not to grieve over his unfortunate situation. Though the inexorable fate has burdened me with melancholy in my sailing shuttle, is broken by a fierce wave, though I am destined to be gloomy and my fields are not green, the moon does not silver the stream and the roses no longer scarlet. But what to do in this life? I have not completely lost everything, and in my fiery chest the heat of feeling is still preserved. Let sorrow crush me and shed tears, often. But I am not completely outdated. I still love, I dream. My wife, my children, my soul knows how to inquire, and I do not need eyes to admire them with my heart. Then the poet, let me remind you, at that time still a little known to anyone, literally gone, glory is ahead, speaks of how his heart aches for his loved ones, especially for his son and daughter. What can he, the father, crippled and helpless, give them? There's only one hope. May our merciful Father listen to the unfortunate prayer and give a blessing to the innocent for my crown of thorns. And soon the fear disappears, prayer warms the heart, and suddenly on rainbow rays, hope flies with faith. The poems of the blind Kozlov are striking in the visibility of the depicted. And the green beyond the river maiden's field was before my eyes, and the holy monastery was filled with crosses burning like heat. From the walls to alluring streams, the Donlika was clearly variegated. Here is a country house, and the lime trees there the chapel wanted to hide. On the neighboring hills, gardens and cottages flaunted, and in bright evenings the lights were illumined by a stream of crimson. and the green of groves and glades merged with the blue firmament, and a golden mist spread over the white stone Moscow. And the visibility is the depiction not only of what the poet saw in his sighted life, but also what he who had never been to the borders of the fatherland could only imagine. For example, the Alps, an impregnable stronghold of granite ridges and the sovereign majesty from the birth of centuries, uneven heaps of scattered mountains so boldly marveling to gaze under the sky, shelters of frost and snowy masses where the storm rumbles, the waterfall roars, steep rapids where the Roman eagle wandered, how the bold one passed through the abysses, peaks of terrible sacred beauty, take me for the bosom of a thunderstorm, high far away in that dark, thick darkness, where in secret conversation the soul is with the divine. The spring night breathed with bright southern beauty. Quietly the Brenta flowed, silver by the moon, reflected by a fiery wave the glitter of transparent clouds, and fragrant steam rises from the green shores. Gogol, in his article on Kozlov's poetry, wrote about the visibility as follows. Looking at the iridescent colors and colors with which his magnificent pictures of nature boil and shine, you immediately learn with sadness that they have already been lost to him forever. They would never appear to a beholder in such a bright and even increased brilliance. They can only be the property of a person who has not admired them for a long time, but has faithfully and strongly preserved the memory of them, which grew and enlarged in the ardent imagination and shone even in the inseparable darkness. But even in these creatures in which it seems he strives to forget all the sadness that concerns his own soul, and catches visible nature with invisible eyes, both here and under the flowers a quiet sorrow burns. The reader probably already had a question. How did he write poetry, this poet? Because there was no Braille, script, or the other modern devices at that time. The eyes, hand, pen of the poet was his daughter Alexandra Alina. As she was called in the family, Alina wrote down the poems that her father pronounced aloud. First in draft, then she made corrections under his dictation, then rewrote the final version in white. The daughter read aloud to her father literary novelties. He certainly wanted to be aware of the journal and book process, and was the secretary of all Ivan Ivanovich's correspondence. The handwriting of this girl was known to almost all famous writers of the Pushkin era. It must be said that Kozlov, chained to a chair and blind, certainly did not feel lonely. His apartment was one of the centers of literary St. Petersburg. Who did not participate in the heated discussions at Kozlov's. Ivan Ivanovich, lively, hot-blooded, witty, always impeccably dressed and combed. The hand of his faithful wife, Sofia Andreevna, amused everyone with his colossal memory for texts, including those in foreign languages. Friends said that Ivan Ivanovich had a library in his head. In the 70s of the 20th century, literary critic Viktor Afanasyev, 1932 to 2015, wrote a book about the poet Ivan Kozlov, Life and Lear. The book contains important biographical information. We learn about the poet's ancestors who served the state since the time of Prince Dmitry Donskoy, and about his parents and about the devoted wife of Ivan Ivanovich, Sofia Andreevna Davidova. And Afanasyev says that during this patriotic war of 1812, Ivan Ivanovich Kozlov left the service in the office of the capital's mayor and volunteered for the Second Committee for the Education of the Moscow Military Force, that is, the militia. And from morning to night he fought with merchants, proving to them that now was not the time to stand behind the price of cloth, fodder, and everything else necessary for the militia. And then the Moscow Governor General Fyodor Vasilievich Rostopchin, the author of the legendary Fire, sent Kozlov to Rybinsk to restore order in the hospitals for the wounded. Responding to the ardent call of Kozlov, then an unknown man, the townspeople of all classes instantly collected bed linen, dishes, provisions, and warm clothes for the soldiers. But all of this was, of course, to the point of blindness. And to literature, however, for all the merits of Afanasyev's book, due to the conditions of the Soviet era, it is devoid of that spiritual Christian content without which Kozlov does not exist. The author had to omit a lot, telling about the life and the feat of one of his favorite poets. I do not know whether Viktor Vasilievich Afanasyev foresaw that at a time that he himself would end his life as the Optina monk Lazarus, and among his last works would be the fundamental chronicle of Optina, the vertigrad of the eldership, the Optina Patirikon against the background of the history of the monastery. Let us try as far as in our power to fill the gap for which, of course, the researcher cannot be reproached. Kozlov is a son of his era, a romantic to the core. What is the romanticism? In fact, this is a conviction and the right of a person to be himself, to be different from everyone else, to determine his life from the inside and not from the outside. Personality in the work of the Romantics is exalted. It is not determined by the historical or social process. It is not a product of the environment man is in himself, and therefore not quite realistic. The realism, after a while, will consider the personality in all its inevitable dependence, in all its connections with the environment, epoch, and society. But Romanticism does its job, forcing you to pay attention to the personality, to pay tribute to it, to believe in it. And they say about Kozlov that he churched Russian Romanticism. What the heart loves where it suffers, and our merciful God is there. He gives us the cross and he sends us hope in the cross. Thus says the abbot in his dying confession, a mysterious monk whose history is unknown to the brethren of the monastery, and whose behavior is strange. It turns out that he grew up in severe orphanhood. In his youth, he fell in love and, without obtaining the consent of the bride's parents, kidnapped her, thereby saving her from forced marriage. Runaway spouses spend their lives in poverty and oppression, but in love they hope for the forgiveness of the wife's father, for reconciliation with her family. But the news of his father's curse, a false rumor spread by the hero's rival, kills his beloved. The child also dies. The hero goes from despair and murmuring to humility, acceptance of God's will. Love understands miracles with some secret expectation. The heart trembled with hope. I looked up at the heavens. He dared to ask them with the tears, and it seemed to me that in return I was given the serene ocean with its imperishable stars. From that time on, my father, I found consolation in my own distress, and with a heavy hope, with her cross to suffer a union. Sometimes I shed tears, but their hope was delightful, and quiet sorrow replaced my severe sorrow. But then the hero will have to understand that grace is not given to us forever. It is easy to lose it if the heart is not cleansed of passions. A meeting with a simple peasant family returning from the field, and I see among the sheaves, sitting in a wreath of cornflowers, a baby with scarlet cheeks, evokes envy of someone else's happiness and a mad murmur. I could hardly breathe in the murky darkness. Everything merged as in a heavy dream. Already the feeling of life was cut off, and I lay between the coffins, deader than the cold dead. Further, the hero accidentally meets the murderer of his son and wife, his rival, who at one time spread a false rumor about the curse of his daughter by her father, and betraying the only hope that is God, kills him. Realizing what he has done, the hero, the future black monk, does not dare to enter God's temple, and even more so does not hope to enter the kingdom of heaven. It is closed to him forever. How in heaven to embrace an angel with bloody hands, but the hope for forgiveness, it turns out, is not dead. The hero enters the monastery, takes monastic vows. He faces a long, hard, terrible road, but in the end, it is a way of salvation. The end of the poem is absolutely miraculous. Let me remind you which delighted Pushkin. And the ringing is heard 3 times over the midnight wave, and the news of the departed is carried far away by a shaky river. Into the cave the prophetic ringing rushed, where the righteous schema monk was saved. Dead, the elder whispered, opened the cache and took the rosary. The fisherman's serene sleep is interrupted by him in the hut of the coast. The suckling infant began to cry. He's baptized by his sleepy mother. He begins to pray and quietly rocks the cradle, and before the smoldering fire again, I fell into a deep sleep. And through that field a traveler walked with a sweet wife. They chased away their horror in the dark night with a merry song. As soon as the bells rang out, they crossed themselves, embraced, went sadder hand to hand, and the sound died away in the darkness of night. It is also impossible not to dwell on the poem Princess Natalia Borisovna Dologor, Dol, Gold, Dolgor, Dolgorukaya, and reading Russia, This Creation of Kozlov from 1827 caused a real stir. It also became the fate of the heroine, echoed the fate of the wives of the Decembrists who followed their husbands to Siberia. Without immersing ourselves in the story of Natalia Dolgoruki, see Sheremeteva as Schema Nectaria, 1714 through 1771, the wife of Ivan Alexeyevich Dolgoruki, who was executed during the reign of Empress Anna Ivanova, and also without reproaching the Romantic poet for the lack of documentary accuracy. Let us pay attention to something else, to the subtlety and lightness of the poetic narration, the very visibility, the author's lively compassion for the heroine, admiration for her loyalty, meekness, and patience. The image of the village priest who gives Natalia Borisovna shelter is unforgettable. She returns from Siberian exile to Moscow on foot with a baby in her arms, which in reality did not happen. He is a righteous man, a man full of love, and a kind chronicler. He keeps the memory of the former owner of the abandoned estate, Count Boris Sheremetyev, Natalia's father, and her own tragic fate. The heroine's way of the cross, marital, maternal, Christian, ends in Kiev and the Ascension Florovsky Monastery. Everything is given to her. She hearkened that eternal wisdom said, whoever desires the kingdom of Christ, the beatitude, let him renounce earthly things. And through the valley of tears and troubles, with the cross follows him. This is her path and a new angel, ready to go to heaven. She stands before the altar, in her hand with a mysterious cross. In the sea of life there is a wave in vain, from the storm of fatal passions. I have come to seek salvation at thy quiet harbor. Kozlov was an excellent translator, although his translations always acquired too authorial a character and can be considered as independent works. For example, Evening Bells is a free translation of the Irish Romantic poet Thomas Moore, but it became a beautiful Russian song and familiar to many. I did not beat the drum in front of the troubled regiment, translation of the elegy by Charles Wolfe, also an Irishman poet and clergyman. On the death of General Sir John Moore, but how much truly Russian tragic poetry is in this gloomy text. And the smoky lights of torches in the grave dug deep by the bayonets for lack of shovels, and the military cloak instead of a coffin, and the comrades in arms who tomorrow may have to lie down in the same way, and the military brevity of their farewell, and the need to observe silence during this farewell. This reminds us too much. Poetry is timeless. Personally, I like Kozlov's translations by Adam Mickiewicz most of all. Knowing the Russian language perfectly, Mickiewicz could appreciate the efforts of his friend. He did not object to the destruction of the rigid structure of the sonnet because the result was a feeling of flight. The spirit is carried by the flight of the mast, I exclaimed at the cry of the swimmers. My imagination curls like strands of unsteady sails, and I fall on the ship, I press my breast. It seems to me that I make the ship move with my breast. And stretching out my hands involuntarily, I fly with him through the depths, easily gratifying, dear to me. He learned how to be a bird at ease. Thanks for listening. Oh, goodness. That's pretty crazy. Yeah, that's where I grew up in Michigan. It's terrible what's going on. You know, there's some really simple thing that we could do if our country really cared about people in these foreign countries, then we'd make it safe for them to live in their native homeland. Bringing people out of their native homeland and dumping them somewhere else isn't a solution. It isn't kindness, it isn't loving, it's exploitive, and it destroys our country from within. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I saw that there was arrests happening in Minnesota. Maybe some corrupt politician is trying to save them from being deported, the ones that are here illegally. It's really interesting times in this world, isn't it? So I'll do some readings here a little bit later. I'm going to take a little bit of a break. Said I'm not feeling the greatest today. I'm kind of trying to struggle through it the best I can. So I might just take a little break. I think I want to see the Hagia Sophia taken back. That should not be a mosque. That needs to be fixed. We should bring Byzantium back. I'm all for that. Especially since I have these videos and pictures of what happens to women under Sharia law. I have some stuff I just can't show on YouTube because it's not safe. But they hold a woman down facing the ground and they put a huge bowl under her throat and then they cut her throat and God knows what they do with the blood. It's the most horrific thing that you'll ever see. And I think if all these bleeding heart people that think it's such a great idea to dump these people in our country were to see that, they'd be horrified. They'd have nightmares. Plus all the pictures that I have of children that were killed by them. But if you look at Christian Prince's channel today, what he put up about the Pope, he showed some of these pictures as he called out the Pope for his stupidity. I can't tell you what he called the Pope because it was some harsh words, but it's true. What a fool. But it just goes to show that that's not the right church. And I don't think Orthodoxy is ever going to be able to get with that. Orthodoxy is never going to accept that heresy, that anathema. I love you all, brothers and sisters. Thanks for joining me. And I'll do some more reading here in a little bit. I'm going to take a break. Pray for me if you would. For work, for health. I love you all, brothers and sisters, and thank you so much. God bless. I'll see you in a bit.